Welcome to Coremates. This is a podcast where we slow things down enough to hear ourselves think, where we talk about inner patterns, quiet decisions, and the parts of life that don't scream for attention, but quietly shape everything. Coremates isn't about fixing yourself. It's about understanding yourself deeply enough to stop living on autopilot. Every Sunday, we sit with one subject, not to oversimplify it, but to stay with it long enough for something real to surface. And today's subject is one that almost everyone is inside, without realizing it. Today, we're talking about comfort and why staying inside it for too long can quietly turn your life into something heavy, anxious, and small. This episode is about the illusion of safety, about how choosing what feels easy today can slowly create a life that feels deeply uncomfortable tomorrow, and about why discomfort, the kind we usually avoid, might actually be the doorway to a calmer, more stable, more alive future. Because comfort isn't always rest. Sometimes, it's just fear that learned how to sound reasonable. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I choose stagnation." It never sounds like that.
No.
It sounds like it's fine. I'll deal with it later. At least it's stable. Comfort doesn't arrive as danger. It arrives as logic, as maturity, as responsibility. And that's what makes it so powerful and so invisible. Because when nothing is obviously wrong, we stop asking whether something is quietly missing. I noticed this first in my routines. Things I defended not because they fulfilled me, but because they were familiar. Days that felt predictable, yet strangely heavy. Weeks where nothing bad happened, but nothing expanded either. For me, it showed up as staying. Staying in situations that didn't hurt enough to leave, but didn't nourish enough to grow. And I kept telling myself that discomfort meant something was wrong, instead of asking whether comfort was slowly freezing me. That's the trap. Comfort feels safe, but it doesn't ask anything of you. And because it doesn't ask, you don't notice what you're losing. Your adaptability, your confidence, your tolerance for uncertainty. Over time, comfort doesn't protect your nervous system. It weakens it. Because a system that never stretches starts to interpret everything unfamiliar as a threat. And that's how people end up anxious in lives that look perfectly fine. That's what we want to explore today. How staying comfortable can quietly make life harder. And why choosing discomfort, consciously, might be the most stabilizing thing you can do for your future. I keep hearing people say, "I just want to stay in my comfort zone," and every time I pause, because I'm not sure we ever stop to ask what we actually mean by that. When someone says comfort, what are they really referring to? Is it peace? Is it happiness? Or is it just the absence of immediate stress? Because those are very different things, but we talk about them as if they're the same.
Exactly.
And I think this confusion is where the problem begins. What most people call a comfort zone isn't a place where they feel good, it's a place where they feel less activated, less challenged, less exposed. It's not about feeling fulfilled. It's about feeling predictable. And predictability can feel like safety, even when it's slowly suffocating you. That's such an important distinction. Because comfort, in the way we use it today, is often just a low-demand state, emotionally, cognitively, even socially. A place where you don't have to make new decisions, regulate unfamiliar emotions, or risk being seen differently. And the brain loves that. Not because it's healthy, but because it's efficient.
Yes.
The brain is always trying to conserve energy. So when it finds a pattern that's already mapped, already tested, already familiar, even if that pattern is unfulfilling, it will prefer it over uncertainty. This applies to everyone. Teenagers avoiding social risk because rejection feels overwhelming. Adults staying in jobs that drain them because at least they know what tomorrow looks like. Even older adults resisting new routines or relationships, not because they don't want connection, but because starting again requires energy they're not used to spending anymore. And what's tricky is that this doesn't feel like fear. It feels like logic, like responsibility, like realism. People say things like, "I'm just being practical," or "at this stage of my life, this is enough." But often, that enough is actually a way of avoiding the discomfort of growth, because growth asks something from you. It asks for emotional engagement, for vulnerability, for tolerance of uncertainty. Comfort asks for nothing, and that's why it's so seductive. We also confuse calm with fulfillment. You can have a life that looks calm, no major crises, no dramatic conflicts, and still feel deeply unsettled inside. Because calm without meaning eventually turns into numbness, and numbness is often misread as peace. But peace has aliveness in it, presence, connection. Numbness is quiet, but it's disconnected. That's where the myth really collapses. Because comfort is not safety, familiar is not healthy, and calm is not the same as fulfilled. But we've been taught to optimize for the wrong thing, especially in a culture that rewards stability over adaptability. We praise people for being settled, consistent, reasonable, without asking whether that consistency is still serving their nervous system, their identity, or their future. And the longer someone stays in that low-demand state, the harder it becomes to leave it. Not because they're incapable, but because their tolerance for discomfort slowly decreases, which is why comfort zones don't feel like cages at first. They feel like relief, until one day they feel like weight. And that's where the question shifts. Not, is this comfortable? But, is this still allowing me to grow? I think this is the moment where people start blaming themselves, where they say, why am I like this? Why can't I just change? And I want to pause there because the resistance people feel isn't a personal weakness. It's biological. Our brains were never designed to make us fulfilled. They were designed to keep us alive. Yes, and that distinction changes everything. Because once you understand that the brain's primary job is survival, not happiness, a lot of the shame around resistance disappears. The brain doesn't ask, will this expand you? It asks, will this keep you safe? And safety, to the brain, usually means familiarity, which is why comfort feels so convincing. When you stay in familiar routines, familiar environments, familiar roles, your nervous system stays relatively quiet. Your stress levels stay low, at least on the surface. And the brain reads that quiet as success. But what the brain doesn't calculate well is long-term cost. Because while comfort lowers stress in the short term, it also reduces your adaptability over time. It's like protecting a muscle so carefully that it never has to work. Eventually, it becomes too weak to carry even small weight. And that's exactly what happens neurologically. Without novelty, without challenge, without small doses of uncertainty, the brain's ability to rewire itself, to stay flexible, starts to decline. Not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly. Which is why people don't notice the shift until anxiety shows up. They'll say things like, I don't know why I'm anxious, nothing is wrong. But what's happening is that their system has lost its tolerance for stimulation. So even minor changes start to feel overwhelming. That's such an important point. Because chronic comfort doesn't calm the nervous system, it makes it fragile. When the system isn't gently challenged, it becomes hypersensitive. Things that once felt manageable, a new conversation, a decision, a change in routine, suddenly feel like threats. And avoidance reinforces that. Every time you avoid discomfort, your brain learns a lesson. It learns, avoidance worked. You're safe now. So it strengthens the fear circuits instead of weakening them. Which is why people who stay in comfort for too long often report the same experiences, even though their lives look very different on the outside. They describe a constant low-level anxiety, a fear of making decisions, an overthinking of simple changes. Not because those things are objectively hard, but because their nervous system hasn't practiced handling them. And what's painful is that people interpret this as personal limitation. They think, I'm just an anxious person, or I'm not built for risk. When in reality, they've just been underusing a system that was designed to adapt. Discomfort is the gym for the nervous system. Not extreme stress, but mild, intentional challenge. That's how confidence is built. That's how resilience is trained. Not by staying calm all the time, but by learning that you can survive activation. And the paradox is that the more you avoid discomfort, the more uncomfortable your life becomes. Your world shrinks. Your options feel heavier. Your internal dialogue becomes louder. Whereas people who regularly choose small discomforts, speaking up, trying something new, changing routines, often feel calmer overall. Not because life is easier for them, but because their nervous system trusts itself. So when your brain resists change, it's not betraying you. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. The question is whether you let that instinct run your life, or whether you gently retrain it. It's strange how the most dangerous shifts in life rarely feel violent. They feel boring, ordinary, and perfectly sensible, and yet there's a pattern I keep seeing where the thing that promised safety eventually becomes the very source of unease. Because when you live long enough inside a zone that demands nothing of you, your system begins to slow down in ways you don't notice until the cost shows up as restlessness or a dull anxiety that can hang there like weather. Yes, comfort doesn't stay comfortable. Instead, it decays almost imperceptibly into a suite of softer harms. A restlessness that feels like your life is moving without you, a low-grade anxiety that arrives without a clear trigger and makes ordinary decisions feel heavy, a kind of emotional numbness where feelings no longer have the urgency they once did, and a creeping identity confusion that asks, who am I when I'm not being pushed to become something new? And those costs are slow to accumulate because each day feels fine on its own, until suddenly you wake up and notice how small your world has grown. I keep thinking about people who, from the outside, did everything we say is responsible, steady job, thoughtful relationships, the sensible choices, and yet, after years, they describe a kind of hollowness that's hard to name. Like having a full calendar and an empty interior. They have safety in the technical sense, and they still get anxious, not because danger is present, but because their capacity to meet challenge has atrophied and every unexpected bend in the road now registers as disproportionate threat. There's a portrait I find myself returning to, someone who avoided conflict their whole life because conflict felt unsafe, who smoothed over discomfort to keep peace, and in doing that they slowly erased the parts of themselves that would have spoken up, taken small risks, or set boundaries, and then, years later, they discover they cannot summon a hard conversation without their chest tightening, not because they lack words, but because the muscle of risk tolerance has never been exercised. And then there's the person who deliberately played small, the quieter kid in the room, the employee who never put their hand up, the partner who always yielded. And what happens in the long term is not that they avoid pain forever, but that they end up trapped by an odd calculus where change feels more terrifying than staying, because staying at a low, predictable setting becomes the only known baseline, and any movement away from it seems like an abyss. Those stories aren't moral failures. They're the predictable result of a system that rewards stability and labels risk as reckless. When every day reinforces safety through sameness, the brain learns to expect sameness and interprets difference as danger, which is why people who have sheltered themselves from small hardships often face a later life in which even ordinary novelty, a job interview, a new relationship, a move to another city, creates overwhelming internal friction. That friction shows up in strange ways. In indecision that turns simple choices into late-night catastrophes of thought, in overplanning an email, because the nervous system wants to control an outcome it's unaccustomed to allowing. In avoiding invitations that might expand imagination simply because the possibility of awkwardness now carries a weight it never used to, and in a slow, gnawing sense that time is passing without meaningful growth. Longitudinal observations echo that pattern. Avoidance correlates with increasing anxiety, not because people are innately fearful, but because the absence of regular challenge reduces stress tolerance and leaves the system brittle. And when stress eventually arrives, it feels disproportionate because there was no graduated training. Without being exposed to small, manageable discomforts, the nervous system never learns the lesson that activation can be survived and come through stronger. And the emotional flatlining you hear people describe, that dull horizon where highs are muted and lows are blunt, isn't some mysterious contemporary disease. It's often the result of a life kept at low arousal for too long, where the mechanisms that let feelings crest and fall are starved of practice and therefore lose amplitude. So life continues, but the texture thins, and that thinning makes meaningful engagement feel more difficult, not less. There's also an identity angle here that's easy to miss until it's heavy. Selfhood is partly produced by the stories we tell about ourselves when we act in new circumstances, when we surprise ourselves, when we meet difficulty and learn a new capacity. If you never put yourself in those stories because you prioritize comfort, you're denying the narrative engine that expands who you are, and later, when you glance back, The narrative has fewer chapters, and the sense of continuity, the I who, persists across situations weakens. That's why regret accumulates quietly in these lives. People later say they regret not trying, not because they failed, but because their untried possibilities become small griefs that add up. And those regrets are not dramatic fireworks, but a slow sediment of what could have been, which then compounds anxiety because the window to pursue some ambitions feels narrower with each passing year. And culturally, we've been given mixed signals about this. We're told to seek balance and to avoid reckless risk, but rarely are we taught how to practice productive discomfort, the kind of small, intentional stretching that builds capacity. So many people oscillate between safety and sudden crisis instead of learning a rhythm of steady expansion that would make later discomfort feel tolerable and even generative. So the delayed cost looks like a life that's outwardly calm and inwardly constricted. Energy that could have been directed toward learning is conserved, but unused. Relationships that could have deepened remain polite and shallow. Creativity that could have blossomed never gets the messy rehearsal it needs. And all of that accrues into a quietly anxious life that paradoxically longs for change while feeling unable to take it. Which brings us to something practical and urgent. The difference between discomfort that destroys and discomfort that trains. The former is chaotic, overwhelming, and harmful. The latter is measured, repeated, and survivable. And when people are taught to tolerate the latter, their nervous systems actually expand their comfort zone. So the very thing they feared most becomes the path to a more enduring, calmer competence. And that is the paradox we want to lift up today. Staying comfortable may feel easy now, but it often manufactures a future that is harder to live in, whereas stepping into small, intentional discomfort may feel uncomfortable in the short term and honest to the bone. But over months and years, it builds a life that is, in a deeper way, more comfortable because it rests on competence, adaptability, and a nervous system that trusts itself. It's fascinating and a little heartbreaking. How the same pattern shows up at every age, only the costume changes. For teenagers, it often looks like an almost physical recoil from embarrassment, a carefully constructed social armor that says, "I'll sit this one out rather than risk looking foolish." And what that teaches them, day after day, is that novelty equals danger and safety equals invisibility, so they learn to shrink before they've even had a chance to discover which parts of themselves are worth showing. Yes, and for young adults the problem can feel both obvious and impossible. They see images of how lives are supposed to accelerate, study, move, travel, hustle. Yet many choose the familiar option because the very prospect of making a public mistake in a world that records everything feels catastrophic, so they trade experiments for certainty, which paradoxically makes choices later feel heavier. As if every fork in the road now risks permanent regret rather than being just another trial. Then there's the adult bracket where the pattern gets woven into identity and logistics. Careers settle into a rhythm not because the work feeds the soul, but because it satisfies the ledger, mortgage, childcare status. And relationships sometimes become places where people practice accommodation rather than negotiation because, realistically, they can't afford instability. The result is a slow accumulation of small self-betrayals. Declining invitations to expand, muting desires for security, and learning to smooth over friction so it doesn't require energy that feels scarce. I see that in how adults talk about being practical or being realistic, phrases that sound mature but often disguise a deeper relinquishing of growth, a trade where the self's possibilities are traded for predictable outcomes. And it's important to name that because pragmatism without vision becomes a slow form of shrinkage. You end up with a practical life that has practical comforts, but is strangely brittle to change. And then there's the later life story, which is rarely rendered in our culture except as nostalgia. People who have spent decades conforming to expectations suddenly face a horizon where the routines that once felt reassuring now feel constricting. And there's an anxiety that shows up as a quiet, almost secret panic. Is it too late to try? Because society tells us that reinvention is a young person's privilege, so older adults often contract their worlds instead of daring new movement. Not because they lack courage, but because the infrastructure of their lives is built on habit and perceived risk. Which is why the cost is universal even if it looks different. The teen who avoids a stage performance misses practice in public courage. The 30-something who stays in a safe job misses small chances to expand competence. The older person who avoids new routines misses the opportunity to restory their life. And in each case, the nervous system learns that the world is less forgiving than it is, which slowly hardens risk into fear and makes future movement feel more impossible than it actually is. There are also cross-cutting dynamics that complicate these stage-specific patterns. Family pressure, economic precarity, cultural expectations, and even technology all shape how comfort gets defined. For a teen, social media can harden risk aversion. For an adult, caregiving responsibilities can make any change logistically fraught. For older adults, structural ageism can make exploration both practically and emotionally risky. And so the comfort zone is not just personal psychology, it's also social scaffolding that either encourages or discourages tiny experiments. And those small experiments are the currency of expansion. Teenagers practicing one awkward conversation, young adults taking a short course in something that scares them, professionals saying yes to a stretch project even though it will be clumsy at first, retirees trying a class or a new community role. Those acts accumulate into a different kind of life architecture, one in which the comfort zone slowly expands because it's been reinforced by micro-discomforts that were survivable and instructive. But the real tragedy is how normalized the opposite pattern has become. People who once might have seen risk as a teacher now read every discomfort as evidence that they're failing, and so they avoid, postpone, and rationalize, while the world around them and their inner life grows narrower. Emotionally, they become more fragile, decisions more paralyzing, and the story they can tell about themselves shorter and less generous. I think it helps to remember that each life stage carries its own appropriate forms of challenge, and that we don't need to be reckless to grow. For a teenager, the challenge might be speaking once in a classroom. For a parent in midlife, it might be saying no to an obligation that actually drains them. For someone later in life, it might be learning to navigate an app so they can stay connected. These are not heroic feats in the cinematic sense. They're the quiet, cumulative courage that reshapes a life. And importantly, the kind of discomfort that builds capacity is calibrated to the person's situation and resources. It's incremental, it's reversible, and it's designed to teach rather than break. That's how the comfort zone expands. Not through dramatic overhaul, but by the patient accumulation of survivable exposures to uncertainty. So the key insight for listeners at any age is, your comfort zone will adapt to whatever you feed it, and the content you feed it determines whether it becomes a soft, regenerating base or a narrow, brittle shell. And the beautiful news buried in that observation is that it's never purely too late. The nervous system remains plastic enough that, over time, even modest, consistent practice with discomfort can widen possibility in surprisingly humane ways. What I want to say here, before we give people a list of things to do, is that discomfort isn't a moral test, it's practice. It's the difference between thinking you're a person who is brave and learning how to tolerate activation in your body so that activation no longer feels like a catastrophe, and that shift from seeing bravery as a fixed badge to seeing it as something you can build is the single most important change in how we talk about growth, because once you accept that tolerance is trainable, the whole thing stops being about personality and starts being about habit and design. Yes, and the nuance there matters. Courage in the movies looks like dramatic action, but in real life, courage is a sequence of small, deliberate choices that gradually increase your capacity to be with difficulty. It's saying one hard truth you've been softening for months. It's stepping into a new room and introducing yourself even if your voice trembles. It's allowing an uncomfortable emotion to arrive without immediately rescuing yourself with distraction. And those acts, repeated, rewire expectation. The nervous system learns that activation is survivable and therefore less threatening, which over time makes the world feel less hostile and more workable. Scientifically, that makes sense if you think of the nervous system as a muscle that responds to load. We don't ask someone to lift the heaviest weight on day one. We give them progressive stress that's challenging but not crushing, because small, consistent strain builds capacity and confidence, and the same principle applies emotionally. Predictable, Voluntary discomfort, practiced in safe increments, increases resilience far more effectively than sheer optimism or motivational pep, because confidence follows action. You don't think yourself into courage, you walk yourself into it. So the practical translation of that is important. It's not be brave or change your mindset. It's designing micro-experiments that let you test your edges without breaking yourself. For example, choose one small thing this week that's mildly uncomfortable and make it reliable. Say a honest sentence in a conversation you usually smooth over, or show up to a class where you know you'll be a beginner. Or let yourself feel a shame or sadness for 5 minutes without trying to fix it with scrolling or food or explanation. And notice, after 1 week, that the action itself starts to feel less enormous, and your internal threshold for disturbance inches upward. And it's critical that these are voluntary and predictable, that you choose the discomfort and can stop it if it becomes too much, because unpredictability and coercion produce trauma responses rather than growth. The sweet spot is a pressure you can say no to, one you can attempt, fail at, and try again from, so the lesson your body learns is I can be activated and still be safe. There's also a humility in this work that's worth naming. Practicing discomfort doesn't make you immune to fear, and it doesn't mean you'll enjoy the activation, but it changes the relationship. You move from avoidance to curiosity, from tactical escape to a question like, what does this feeling want me to learn? And curiosity itself is a regulating force because it reframes threat as information, which reduces the intensity of the alarm and gives you a clearer space to respond, not react. I want to give listeners a tiny scaffold they can use immediately, something that's not prescriptive but functional. First, pick a 1-week edge practice. One small discomfort you'll try 3 times, not once, not indefinitely. Something like speaking up at a meeting for 30 seconds, or taking a route home you've never taken, or keeping your phone in another room for an hour after dinner. Second, set a micro debrief. After each attempt, write 1 sentence. What did I feel physically? What did I think? What happened? And third, keep the intensity low enough that you can repeat it without shame, because the point is repetition, not dramatic proof. And notice this. Progress rarely shows up as a single grand victory. It arrives as calm where there used to be panic, as an easier sentence, as a small reduction in the internal volume of worry. Those tiny changes compound, and over months you'll find that choices that once paralyzed you are now merely questions, and that's the core reward of practicing discomfort. Increased bandwidth to live a fuller life, not the absence of fear. We should also be compassionate about the context. Practicing discomfort looks different depending on resources, responsibilities, and safety. A person with caregiving needs, financial precarity, or health issues needs practices scaled to their reality. Maybe their courageous act is a 15-minute break they actually get to take without guilt, or asking for help once a week, or naming a boundary in one relationship. The principle remains the same, small, voluntary. Survivable activation that teaches the nervous system something new, but the scale and content must fit the person's life. Finally, and this is a soft but radical point, discomfort practiced in community is easier. We were designed to learn socially, so doing these micro-practices with another person, a friend, a partner, a therapist, a peer group, provides external safety and normalizes the wobble. You don't need to be heroic alone. You need reliable company that sees you tremble and stays present, which itself expands your tolerance faster than isolated bravado. So to summarize, and I want to be very clear, discomfort is not a character flaw. It's a capacity you grow by deliberate, repeated exposure that is safe, predictable, and meaningful, and the payoff is real. More ease in the long run, not pain, more choice, not less. It's not about being brave once. It's about becoming a person who, over time, can bear activation and still move forward. One thing I keep returning to is how the messages we receive about comfort are never neutral. They are saturated with an economy of attention and profit that shapes what safe looks like. So when a company sells you a padded life, a subscription that promises less friction, an app that optimizes your sleep for marketable productivity, a self-help thread that packages comfort as the endpoint, they are not just offering rest, they are shaping a habit loop that privileges sameness, repeatability, and low friction, and because those things are profitable, they get rewarded by platforms, advertisers, and cultural narratives until being comfortable becomes not just a personal preference, but a social expectation. Exactly. And that pressure operates in two directions at once. On one side, you have hustle culture telling people they must squeeze more out of every hour, monetize pain, and perform growth as a commodity, while on the other side, you now have a booming comfort culture that monetizes avoidance, selling curated calm and curated ease as products you can buy to look well-adjusted without actually doing the hard inner work, which creates a strange middle ground where people are told to be comfortable and visible at the same time, comfortable enough to not disrupt systems, visible enough to be valuable, and that contradiction quietly narrows the field of what genuine risk and growth can look like. And the algorithm loves that contradiction because it runs on scale and predictability. Sameness performs well. Repeatable formats, familiar narratives, the same emotional beats over and over. So creators quickly learn that radical honesty, messy growth, and genuine discomfort are hard to monetize at scale, which means the feeds we scroll are saturated with simplified versions of life that reward neatness and penalize messy expansion. And when you live inside that stream day after day, your instinct is shaped toward contentment that looks polished rather than the kind of real disquiet that actually teaches you how to expand. Which brings us to wellness being sold as avoidance rather than engagement. There's a flourishing market for things that promise to soothe the immediate symptom without asking why the symptom appeared in the first place. Supplements that promise calm without addressing rhythm. Routines that sound restorative but are really performance metrics. Retreats that look restful on Instagram but set you up for re-entry shock. And because these options are packaged attractively and placed within algorithmic reach, people can feel like they're taking care of themselves while actually insulating themselves from the small frictions that would build capacity over time. The cultural effect of that is profound. Rather than cultivating practices that teach tolerance of discomfort, we cultivate habits that remove discomfort, rather than building community rituals that help people practice vulnerability safely. We consume products that privatize care and reduce exposure, and the result is a society where discomfort is medicalized, hidden, or commodified instead of being integrated as a natural, teachable part of life. And don't underestimate fear-based consumption here. Many industries sell products on the premise that you should avoid a future threat right now, so we end up buying layers of prevention, safety, and soothing that reduce present friction, but also remove the small failures that would have taught us resilience. The more we outsource discomfort to external solutions, the less opportunity we have to practice meeting it ourselves, which means our tolerance narrows at the same time our appetite for marketed reassurance grows. So culturally, we end up with this odd double bind. On the surface, we look like a generation that prizes comfort, but underneath we are collectively more brittle. Because the systems we participate in reward appearances of ease and punish the messy work of becoming, and that punishment can be economic, social, or psychological, a missed opportunity, less visibility, or the internal judgment that we're failing. And many people, sensing those costs, default back to comfort because it is a safer way to be accepted. Which is why the push to embrace discomfort cannot be framed simply as an individual morality play. It has to be a cultural conversation about what we reward, how we design platforms and industries, and how we teach the next generation to value process over polish, learning over metric, and messy experiments over curated proof. Because if we don't change the scaffolding that prizes sameness, we'll keep training nervous systems to shrink and then wonder why everyone is anxious inside lives that look tidy. At the end of the day, the key reflection we keep returning to is simple and a little painful. We're told to be comfortable, but not fulfilled, and that contradiction is a cultural choice as much as an individual one, so the practical work becomes twofold. Reclaiming personal practices that expand tolerance and, quietly and steadily, refusing the cultural contracts that equate being comfortable with being whole. I think the deepest clarity comes when we stop thinking of comfort and discomfort as opposites, as if one is good and the other is bad, and instead begin to see them as partners in a dynamic rhythm of life. Because the truth is that a life spent only in discomfort is exhausting, unsustainable, and often destructive, just as a life spent only in comfort is quietly corrosive, emotionally, mentally, even physically. And what we're learning, slowly, is that a healthy life is not about maximizing one or the other, but about cultivating a cycle where comfort becomes the space where you recover, integrate lessons, and replenish. And discomfort becomes the space where you stretch, experiment, and grow capacity, so that each feeds the other and neither dominates in a way that distorts reality. Yes, and what's so profound about that is how it reframes the way we think about effort and rest. Growth doesn't demand martyrdom, and ease doesn't demand passivity. It's about giving yourself permission to be fully present in both, and that presence, when exercised repeatedly, teaches the nervous system that you can handle challenge and that you can savor respite without guilt, so that discomfort no longer feels like danger, and comfort no longer feels like stagnation and the internal. Climate shifts from tension and worry to something calmer, more expansive, and more generative. I also think it's important to say, especially for anyone who feels pressure from outside voices or internalized judgment, that this balance doesn't mean destroying your life in pursuit of growth, and it doesn't mean taking heroic leaps every day. It means small, consistent calibrations. Noticing when your body and mind are contracting, choosing a stretch that's survivable, and then honoring the space that allows you to recover afterward, because the cumulative effect of these micro-adjustments over months or years is what produces real freedom. Not the dramatic sacrifices or one-time epiphanies that culture so often romanticizes. And the liberation in that understanding is quiet but immense. You realize that protecting your life from discomfort isn't the same as preserving it. In fact, overprotection narrows horizons, limits possibility, and eventually generates a subtle, pervasive unrest, whereas allowing yourself to step gently into discomfort and to return to comfort without guilt teaches that life can be both challenging and safe, that experiences can be hard and nourishing at the same time, and that you, as a human being, can navigate both without eroding your integrity, energy, or joy. So, for anyone listening, the takeaway, not as a checklist, not as a demand, but as a reflection, is that a life worth living is measured not by the absence of discomfort, but by the conscious alternation between recovery and challenge, between quiet and activation, between holding and stretching, and that cultivating that rhythm quietly, day after day, allows both the body and the mind to expand safely, the spirit to remain curious, and the choices to feel generous rather than fearful. And it's liberating to realize, finally, that this isn't a fixed skill or an innate trait. It's a practice you can return to again and again, adjusting tempo, scale, and intensity as life shifts, so that even in the face of uncertainty, aging, social pressure, or internal fear, you have a framework to navigate existence with more clarity, more resilience, and, ultimately, more self-trust. And that's the real invitation of this episode, to stop imagining that you have to protect yourself from experience in order to survive, and instead start seeing discomfort as a teacher, comfort as a restorative partner, and yourself as someone capable of balancing the two in ways that feel grounded, humane, and deeply alive. And with that, I think we can gently close today's conversation, reminding everyone that this rhythm is ongoing, and it's okay to begin anywhere. Even small steps are meaningful. Exactly. And if you felt a little tug to try something slightly uncomfortable today, take it as a nudge, not a demand. That's all it needs to be. Before we go, let me leave you with something small but exact. The question this episode wants to plant in your life is not, how do I get comfortable? Because comfort in itself is not the enemy, but rather, what is the particular discomfort in front of me asking me to grow? And I mean that in the most humane way possible, not as a demand for performance, but as an invitation to notice one specific place where you habitually choose what's easy over what's honest. One tiny habitual concession you make, because it's less trouble in the short term, and simply see it without judgment as data about what your nervous system and your life might need next. Yes, and if it helps, treat this like a gentle experiment rather than a moral test. Pick one small thing this week that feels slightly uncomfortable but survivable. Speak one truth you've been softening. Try a short new task that you've been avoiding, or let yourself feel an unpleasant emotion for 30 seconds without fixing it. And afterward, notice what changes in how you feel about yourself. Not as proof that you must become someone else, but as evidence that your capacity is not fixed. and that the practice of tolerating mild activation actually recalibrates your life toward more real comfort later on. There is no pressure here, only curiosity. Notice, name, maybe try. And whether you take one tiny step or simply sit with the question for another week, that noticing matters. It loosens shame, it opens choice, and it begins to teach your body that uncertainty can be survived and even used as fuel for a steadier kind of ease. If this felt like a useful place to sit for a while, we'd be glad if you stay with us. Subscribe to Coremates for another slow conversation every Sunday at 10 a.m. And if you want, share this episode with one person who might appreciate permission to practice discomfort gently. Otherwise, just carry the question with you this week and see what it reveals. Until next Sunday, take care of yourself, not as a project, but as a companion.